Here are 3 people your bug out plan probably forgot. Jake, 8 years old, high support needs, and the moment the atmosphere in the house goes wrong, he goes with it. Irene, elderly, dementia, limited mobility, and deeply dependent on familiarity to stay regulated. And Buster, a good dog, genuinely, until the household is under stress and he isn't. These aren't edge cases. They're the people a lot of us are actually planning around. And most prepper content is written as though they're just not there. Let's fix that. Preparedness is often sold as independence. Grab your bag, adapt on the fly, and keep moving. But for a lot of people, preparedness is not really about independence at all. It's about responsibility. It's about knowing that someone in your world cannot simply be treated like a capable adult under stress, and planning accordingly. This does not make your household worse, but love does not remove the burden. It just tells you that you are going to carry it. So as we go, I'm going to keep coming back to Jake, Irene and Buster. Not to turn them into props, but to show how the same planning habits keep appearing in different forms. This video is about how to do that well, not sentimentally, not theatrically, and not as if every problem ends with a bug-out bag and a heroic march into the woods. I want to talk about what preparedness looks like when one member of the household changes the logistics of everything. The prepper world can sometimes talk as though every household is a little team of rugged problem solvers. Everyone does their bit, everyone carries their share, and anyone who cannot is treated as dead weight. But none of them is a flaw in the plan. The flaw is pretending that they're not there, or pretending that they will somehow behave like calm, capable adults just because their situation is urgent. A better way to think about this is as a system requirement. In other words, their needs are part of the landscape. You do not get angry that the river is in the way. You build the bridge with the river in mind. In the same way, you build the plan with the real household in mind. That shift changes the whole tone. You stop asking, how do I make this person less inconvenient? And start asking, what does the system need to do if this person is to stay safe? When people think about vulnerability, they often jump straight to the label: autism, dementia, disability. But labels don't tell you much about what a household actually has to do when things go wrong. The US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or CDC, uses a framework called CMIST in guidance on emergency planning for people with access and functional needs. It stands for communication, maintaining health, independence, support and safety, and transportation. It pushes you away from labels and back towards the actual planning problem. What does the person need from the household when things go wrong? And once you ask that, a pattern starts to appear. The causes are different, but the household keeps having to solve the same kinds of problem. Take communication first. Jake may not be able to explain who he is, what he needs, or what's wrong, especially if he's overwhelmed. Irene may not reliably be able to tell people what medication she has, whether she's actually taken it, where she's meant to be, or what's happened, particularly on a bad day or if she's tired or confused by a strange place. Buster cannot speak at all, so tags, a microchip, and other people understanding quickly that he's a loved family dog and not a stray suddenly matter a great deal. Then maintaining health. For Jake, that may mean accepted foods, medication, routine anchors, and things that stop distress from becoming a bigger problem. For Irene, it may mean medication, continence supplies, warmth, hydration, and proper rest. For Buster, it means food, water, any medication, and the familiar bits of routine and care that keep him well and settled. Then independence. That word can sound slightly odd here because it does not mean rugged self-reliance. It means preserving whatever helps the person function as well as they can. For Jake, that may be familiar objects, routines, headphones, or a way of communicating. For Irene, it may be glasses, hearing aids, a walker, familiar room layout, and enough time not to be thrown off balance. For Buster, it's his usual lead, bed, blanket, bowl, or the familiar cues that help him stay calm and cope well. Then support and safety. Jake may be overwhelmed by noise, light, chaos, and breaks in routine. Irene may become more confused and distressed if she's rushed, tired, cold, or in an unfamiliar place. Buster may go from being a happy, normal dog to barking, pacing, or sticking close because the household feels wrong. In all three cases, the atmosphere itself can make the problem worse. And all three may need more hands-on support than a standard household plan assumes. And finally, transportation. Jake may freeze, refuse to move, or only be movable with something familiar like a stroller. Irene may be slow, unsteady, or simply unable to manage stairs, distance, or rough ground. And with dementia, that can look very different on a good day to a bad one. Buster may pull, hate the car, or end up needing one person fully focused on getting him in and settled. In each case, movement takes longer, takes more effort, and possibly takes more equipment. Once you lay it out that way, you can see why many plans just fall apart. Not because you forgot to buy another torch, but because the real friction in the household was never honestly accounted for. And that's why I think this is the better way to look at it. Not by asking what label a person has, but by asking what jobs the household needs to do well if that person is to stay safe. So what are we actually doing here? Not planning some heroic march into the woods, not even assuming that the answer is to leave home at all. What we're doing is pressure testing the household plan against movement, disruption, and the possibility that one workable place stops being workable. That may mean getting everyone into the car and across town and spending a few nights somewhere else. The point is whether the plan still works when the household member with the least margin is not having a good time of it. This is where a bit of prepper jargon earns its keep. PACE means primary, alternate, contingency, emergency. We covered this in an earlier video on redundancy. And it's useful here because vulnerable people punish single point of failure plans. For the purposes of this example, we're planning an emergency bug out to another location. First, can you move them? Second, can you keep them regulated enough that movement remains possible? If your whole setup depends on one exact sequence going right, it's probably not a good plan. Take movement. For Jake, primary. Get him into the car early, before the atmosphere worsens. Alternate. Use a familiar stroller, buggy, or other accepted way of moving him. Contingency. One adult focuses entirely on Jake while the other sorts out the gear. An emergency. Everyone who's needed gets Jake moved safely, with everything else reduced to the core minimum or left till later. For Irene, primary, car transfer while she's still reasonably settled and steady should be fine. Alternate, less gear and a route that avoids stairs or awkward ground. Maybe someone goes and gets the car and brings it to the door. Contingency, a wheelchair or much slower assisted movement. An emergency, again everyone who's needed helps move Irene safely, with other priorities dropped and the practical cleanup dealt with afterwards. For Buster, primarily into the car in a calm, familiar way. Alternate, lead on, plus snacks, reassurance, familiar cues, and one designated handler to give him a pat. Contingency, if he's not been his usual good boy self, great. Favourite blanket, and one person focused properly on getting him in and settled while the rest of the load is simplified or delayed. An emergency, everyone who's needed helps get Buster moved safely and settled, with the rest of the plan stripped right back and sorted later. The same logic works for regulation as well. The point of PACE is not to sound tactical. It's to prevent your whole household from being held hostage by one failed assumption. I wanted to mention PACE here to help illustrate its applicability to the planning process, not just a kit. One of the least glamorous but most important truths here is that some people do not just add another mouth to feed, they absorb capacity. Jake takes attention, calm and routine. Irene takes time, physical effort, downstairs space, and a great deal of patient handling. Buster may not sound comparable at first, but under stress he can still eat time, space, and attention at exactly the wrong moment. That's not cruelty. That's how it is. If Irene needs both your hands to get down the stairs, then those hands are not carrying water, torches, bags, or the dog crate. If Jake needs your whole attention to stay regulated, you're not simultaneously running a tidy little household crisis response. If Buster can't safely be let loose in the middle of all that, then that's one more chunk of your capacity that's already been assigned. Once you accept that, your prep often gets better very quickly. You stop fantasizing about carrying more and start reducing friction. You store more where it's needed, you simplify, you lighten the bags, and sometimes you accept that the smarter move is not a better backpack, but wheels. A cart, trolley, or wagon may simply fit the household better than bag-based thinking. You make peace with the fact that the right answer may be earlier action and not more action. A lot of preparedness is really pre-positioning, not just owning things, but having the right things in the right place before anyone is tired, frightened, overwhelmed, or in pain. That's why this cannot just be about bags, it has to be about places. At home, the question is whether the environment helps or hinders the person who struggles most. With Jake, that means asking whether the comfort items, headphones, safe foods, and familiar routines are close at hand, or hidden away in an emergency box that will be found too late. With Irene, it means knowing whether the medication is easy to find in low light and whether the downstairs is remotely workable if the stairs become a no-go. With Buster, it's more basic but no less real. Is the lead where it should be? Is his bed actually usable? And do you have the dull practical bits needed to keep him fed, contained and settled? The car matters too, not in a glamorous bug-out sense, just in the plain sense that for many families it's the bridge between one workable place and another. Who gets in first? What has to stay within reach? What cannot be buried in the boot under 3 noble but irrelevant bits of gear? If Jake panics, Irene needs a slower transfer, or Buster's sick, have you arranged the vehicle around reality or around tidiness? Then there's the destination, not just whether it has power and water, but whether it's actually usable for your family. Is there quiet for Jake? Is there a downstairs loo and somewhere familiar enough not to disorient Irene too badly? Is there room for Buster's bed, bowl, lead, and the practical mess that comes with bringing a stressed animal into someone else's house? If you rely on another place in an emergency, then ideally something should already be there. That's staging. Not a dramatic bunker mindset, just a sensible act of making sure the place you may need is not starting from zero. For a household like this, normal life is often hard enough. That matters because home is usually where the adaptations already are. The familiar foods, the usual layout, the medication in the right place, the quiet corner, the downstairs setup, the dog's bed. The cues and routines that give you at least a fighting chance. So when preppers talk as though movement is automatically the answer, I think it's worth pushing back a bit. For a household with someone like Jake, Irene or Buster, bugging in often starts with a big advantage. You're already on home ground. That does not mean bugging in is always easy. A crisis at home can still be rough. Power cuts, heating failures, water outages, short notice hospital runs, transport problems, or simply a bad day can all hit harder when the household already has less slack than most. But if home is still fundamentally workable, staying put may preserve more than it costs. Jake keeps more of his routine, Irene keeps a familiar environment, and with dementia that can make a real difference. Buster stays with his people, in his own territory, with the smells and cues that tell him that life is still basically sane. Bugging out is different. Sometimes it's necessary. Sometimes home is no longer safe, no longer functional, no longer the least bad option. But leaving throws a great deal out of kilter all at once. Jake may lose the very routines and objects that help him stay regulated. Irene may become more confused, less steady, and harder to reassure in an unfamiliar place. Buster may cope far worse in transit or in someone else's house than he ever would at home. And all of that is happening while the adults are also trying to move gear, make decisions, and deal with the crisis itself. So for a household like this, the question is not just, can we leave? It is, what do we lose by leaving? And when is that loss still worth it? That's why I think the honest hierarchy often looks like this. First, normal life, which may already require adaptations and planning just to keep things moving smoothly. Second, staying home in a crisis, where the aim is to preserve as much familiarity and function as possible while riding out disruption. And then third, bugging out, where you accept a lot of disruption because staying home is now not an option. That does not make bugging out wrong. It just means that for some households, it should be treated as a serious threshold rather than the automatic starting point, even more so than for the general population. Pets belong in this conversation because they expose the same planning weaknesses. A lot of people assume Buster will just come along and the whole thing will sort itself out because he's normally part of daily life. But stress changes behaviour. A dog may bolt, bark, bite, refuse the car, or become far harder to handle than usual. A pet that's easy on a normal Tuesday can become one more unstable element in a household that's already stretched. That does not make Buster the same as Jake or Irene, and it does not need to. If someone in your household depends on you, cannot be reasoned with like a calm adult, and creates extra logistical load when life goes wrong, then he belongs in the plan. That's a useful habit of thought well beyond pets. It pushes you to ask a harder and better question. Who in the household changes the logistics of everything the moment normal life stops working? If you're dealing with Jake, Irene and Buster on a bad day, one extra pair of hands can make the world of difference. Not a massive community resilience network, not an overblown fantasy of a neighbourhood command structure. Just one or two people that understand the situation and will not get baffled when things get awkward. It might be a relative, a neighbour, a friend, another parent, or simply someone who can lift, drive, sit with someone, calm things down, fetch what you need, or buy you 10 minutes of breathing space when the system is wobbling. And if you can, don't leave that to chance. See if you can arrange that help in advance. The family across the road may be perfectly happy to take Buster for a while if things go sideways. The carer who normally comes in a bit on Thursdays may be able to stay longer, or come in at short notice if everyone already knows what the plan is. A friend or relative may be willing to be your extra pair of hands, but only if you've had the conversation before the bad day arrives. That's important because help is most useful when it's specific. Not just call me if you need anything, more, if the power goes and Jake's spiralling, could you come and sit with Irene for half an hour? If we have to leave the house suddenly, can you take Buster until we know where we're landing? If things get messy, could you drive, lift, or pick up a few bits from the shop when we might not have time to go? A bit of help in this context is not only capacity, but a welcome boost to morale. And if you can plan it in advance, it becomes one more layer of preparedness rather than one more thing to improvise under stress. All of this remains theory until it's tested. Not necessarily with a grand field exercise, and not necessarily by deliberately making life harder for yourself. Often it's enough to pay attention to ordinary friction. If you can do a deliberate test now and then, good. Try an evening with the power off. Find Irene's medication in low light. Load the car quickly with Jake already stressed and Buster already restless. Feed people from stores without leaning on the exact brands and routines you usually use. See how it goes with one adult absent. But if that kind of deliberate test is off the table, the halfway house is this. Use the minor stress tests that life throws at you anyway. A rough evening, a power cut, a bad patch for Irene, Jake getting overwhelmed while you're already tired, Buster having an odd day, one adult being out, a rushed hospital appointment, a car problem, a disrupted routine. These moments are already giving you information, if you're willing to notice it. Don't look for proof that your plan is brilliant. Look for where it catches. If Jake rejects the headphones, that tells you something. If Irene's comfort items or medication are in the wrong room, that's more useful information. If Buster has a bad time with the car or with being settled in his bed or his usual spot, try to make this a learning experience. If the walker doesn't fit through the route that you imagined, or the whole plan works beautifully only when 2 calm adults are present and both cars are available, that's something you need to know before everything else goes pear-shaped. Preparedness improves when awkwardness is turned into data. And if deliberate stress tests are not realistic for your household, then at least make sure the real-world ones do not go to waste. There's a phrase I rather like for all of this, and it sounds a bit grand, but I think it earns its keep. The noble burden. Because burden is the honest word. Pretending there is no burden does not honour the person you love. It just leaves you less prepared to carry that burden. If Jake is hard to calm, if Irene's hard to move, if Buster can't be left alone, or if any one person in the household requires more from the system than most people do, then yes, that creates a burden. But it's a burden you carry on purpose. Not because it's efficient, and not because it makes for good prepper fantasy content, but because they're yours. And I think this is where the subject becomes more than logistics. Real preparedness is not measured by whether the strongest person in the house can push through discomfort and survive the night. It's measured by whether the one with the least margin can. If your planning is good enough for them, then it's probably getting good in all sorts of other ways too. If this video speaks to your situation or to someone you care about, tell me in the comments what sort of friction your household actually has to plan around. Don't worry about diagnoses if you'd rather not share them. I'm more interested in the planning problem itself, whether that's mobility, communication, regulation, medication, routine, transport, supervision, or something else people rarely talk about. And as a useful exercise, try making your own version of Jake, Irene, and Buster. Not those exact individuals, obviously, but your own 3 examples, or 2, or 1. Work through the logic honestly and see where the plan starts to creak. And if you want preparedness content that starts with real households in real situations, not fantasy ones using this week's doom scenario, please subscribe. That's what I'm trying to build here. Thank you very much for your time and attention, and I look forward to our next video.